The training facility on Corellia thrummed with activity as alien recruits huddled in clusters, swapping tales of battle and conquest. Among them was a small group of young Corelli, whose sleek, silver skin and delicate limb structure contrasted with the rougher, more war-weathered elders who strode through the camp. They were fresh recruits, still sporting unblemished skin and eyes alight with the excitement of training. "Have you heard about the humans?" sneered Grixa, a lanky, wide-eyed youth with an exaggerated expression of disbelief. She was the most vocal of the group, known for her knack for weaving tales, though accuracy was rarely her priority. "They barely know how to harness energy, let alone build proper spacecraft." Her comment was met with snickers, and others joined in, eager to share what they'd heard. Jaren, a shorter but stockier Corelli with a serious, almost unyielding demeanor, leaned in. "I've heard they rely on physical weapons, solid projectiles instead of plasma-based arms. Imagine the mess!" He snorted, his antennae flicking with disdain. "Barbaric." The youngest of the group, Mira, who usually hung back in silence, raised her head. She'd overheard rumors too, whispers of human bravery that didn't fit with her peers' mocking attitude. "They might not be as advanced, but I heard they fought off the Krathen on Altara," she said cautiously. "And survived." A ripple of laughter erupted around her. Grixa rolled her eyes, waving a dismissive hand. "Altara? The Krathen must have been half asleep if humans stood a chance." "You believe everything you hear, Mira." Before Mira could respond, a shadow loomed over the group, and the young aliens fell silent. It was Commander Trexer, a battle-scarred, seasoned veteran whose body bore the marks of countless campaigns. His thick, cobalt skin was cross-hatched with deep scars, and his left antenna had been severed in battle. He regarded them with a sharp, calculating gaze. "What's this chatter I hear about humans?" Trexer's voice was low and rough, the voice of someone who had faced the horrors of war and survived to tell of it. He looked from one recruit to the next, his expression unreadable. Grixa stiffened but recovered quickly, an air of defiance in her posture. "Nothing serious, Commander," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Just stories we've heard about humans and how primitive they are." Trexer's gaze sharpened. He motioned for them to sit, his tone taking on a dark edge. "Primitive, is it? Is that what you think?" The young recruits exchanged wary glances, unsure of where the conversation was headed. Trexer's presence alone demanded respect, and now there was something else in his eyes, a warning, or perhaps a challenge. "Yes, Commander," Jaren spoke up, emboldened by the tension. "Humans are limited, aren't they? They can barely endure half the atmospheres we can. Their technology is generations behind." Trexer nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. "True. Humans are physically weaker, and their technology is not as refined as ours. They bleed easily, they are prone to sickness, and their lifespan is laughably short compared to ours. But what they lack in strength, they more than make up for in ways you couldn't imagine." This response caught the group off guard. Jaren frowned, and Grixa's confidence faltered slightly. Mira, for her part, looked intrigued, her curiosity overriding her hesitation. Trexer continued, his tone darkening. "I have seen humans in battle, alongside our own forces and against them. I've seen their ingenuity, their resilience. These so-called primitives have achieved things that would make even a hardened warrior think twice before dismissing them." There was a murmur among the recruits, a mixture of surprise and skepticism. Grixa crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "If they're so impressive, then why do we hear more stories about their mistakes and failures than their victories?" "Because stories are easier than truth," Trexer replied, his gaze narrowing. "Easy to mock what you haven't seen. But there's a reason the Alliance brought humans into the fold. They are a species like no other. Their ability to endure, to find strength in their weaknesses, is unlike anything I've ever seen." His words seemed to hang heavily in the air, and a silence settled over the group. For a moment, even Grixa seemed subdued. Trexer let the silence stretch, watching the young alien's expressions shift from curiosity to discomfort. Then, leaning forward, he added, "I remember Altara." He spoke softly, yet his voice carried an intensity that silenced the group further. It was no easy feat. The Kraden were relentless, and we were close to losing that outpost. Humans held the line with us, shoulder to shoulder, despite having the least advanced technology in the field. They stayed when others would have run. Mira's eyes widened, and even Jaren looked uneasy. But they were just humans. How could they stand against the Kraden? They didn't have to. They could have pulled back, left us to fend for ourselves, Trexer replied. But they didn't. And when the battle was over, they were the ones who stayed to tend to our wounded, theirs and ours alike. The recruits shifted uncomfortably. Trexer's expression softened, a distant look coming into his eyes. You think humans are weak because they lack our technology or strength. But you don't understand what true strength is until you've seen it under fire. Humans may not be like us, but they possess something that goes beyond physical power. Grixa's face twisted with frustration. But why? Why would they do that? Because it's who they are, Trexer said simply. Humans are survivors. They fight for each other, even when it makes no logical sense. They have a loyalty that defies their own self-preservation, and that is something you can't measure in technology or strength. The silence that followed was thick, laden with thoughts too deep for the young recruits to process easily. Trexer rose, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the group. Perhaps one day you'll see it for yourselves, he said. But until then, remember this, never underestimate a human. What you view as weakness may be a strength that could save your life one day. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving the group in contemplative silence. The young aliens looked at each other, their earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet, unsettled curiosity. As the young recruits sat in contemplative silence, Commander Trexer remained close, pacing slowly as he gathered his thoughts. His gaze fell to the ground, where memories seemed to draw him deeper, resurfacing images of brutal battles and unlikely allies. Without glancing up, he began to speak again, his voice low and steady. Altara, he said, almost to himself. You talk about it like a simple tale. But I was there, and the truth is far darker than any story you've heard. The recruits shifted uneasily, their gazes fixed on the scarred veteran. Even Grixa, normally quick to scoff, felt a shiver of respect as she watched Trexer's face transform, his eyes clouded with the memory of that brutal siege. It started with an ambush. Trexer continued, his tone deepening. Our forces had been spread thin across the planet, and a Kraden fleet caught us off guard. The sky was a sea of fire as our defenses crumbled. They were relentless, with weaponry far beyond anything we'd anticipated. We were sure Altara would fall. But then they came. The humans. Mira leaned forward, her wide, reflective eyes fixed on Trexer. How did they help, Commander? Trexer paused, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Their landing ships were barely capable of breaking Altara's atmosphere, but they brought them down in droves. Waves of human soldiers poured out, wearing armor so primitive compared to ours that it looked like they were dressed in metal shells. He shook his head, marveling. Their ranks were scattered as they hit the ground. But rather than scatter, they regrouped, forming a wall around our broken defenses. They moved quickly, and their lack of fear was astonishing. I remember seeing one human captain stand his ground as the Kraden advanced, his face determined, unbreakable. It was the kind of courage you can't measure. Jaren frowned, his skepticism evident. But wouldn't they have just been overrun? Any other species would have, Trexer replied, his voice dark with conviction. But humans don't fight like we do. They found ways to compensate for their weaknesses. While the Kraden pressed forward with their relentless energy-based weapons, humans used terrain, outflanking maneuvers, and most of all, each other. They were completely unprepared for the Kraden's strength, but they learned as they went. A hushed silence fell over the recruits. Jaren opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling to comprehend. Trexer continued, his gaze distant. There was a moment, a terrible, bloody moment when it seemed all was lost. Our commanders had fallen, our defenses were breached, and I remember standing at the edge of our camp, watching the Kraden advance. Their soldiers are relentless, mindless beasts who know nothing of mercy. I knew we were finished. And then I saw the humans, those fragile, primitive creatures you mocked, running straight into the Kraden lines, covering our retreat with their bodies. Mira gasped, her face pale with disbelief. Trexer nodded solemnly, his gaze flicking to hers. They fought with whatever they had left. When their weapons failed, they resorted to hand-to-hand combat, punching and clawing, refusing to let the Kraden take one more step. Their captain, the one who had stood his ground, was wounded in the leg, but he kept pulling his soldiers back into formation. He was shouting something, a battle cry. It took me a while to understand their language, but when I did, I realized he was calling out to hold the line. To keep fighting, no matter what. Grix's defiance wavered as she stared at Trexer, struggling to imagine such ferocity from humans. Did they survive? Some, Trexer replied quietly. Many didn't. The captain himself fell, his last words a command for his soldiers to protect us, our people, whom he barely knew. But his bravery, it wasn't in vain. That act gave us time to regroup, to push back the Kraden until the reinforcements arrived. The humans knew they were outmatched, yet they held their ground. It was the most reckless, illogical thing I'd ever seen, and the bravest. Trexer looked away, his voice softening. After the battle, as we gathered the fallen, I came across the captain's body. His soldiers had laid him to rest with their own hands, marking his place with a small human symbol. They called it a cross, something from their homeworld. They said it was a symbol of sacrifice and bravery, a way to honor him. He paused, swallowing, his eyes fixed on a distant point only he could see. The young recruits were silent, their earlier confidence shattered. They had never heard of such a thing, a species so fragile, willing to sacrifice so much for strangers. For allies they barely understood. Trexer's voice softened even further. I don't expect you to understand, not fully. It's a hard thing to grasp until you see it for yourself. But those humans showed me something that day. Bravery isn't always about having the best weapons or the toughest skin. Sometimes it's about standing when everyone else falls. It's about pushing forward when every instinct tells you to run. Mira, her voice barely a whisper, asked, Do you think they fought like that because they were afraid? Trexer smiled faintly, a glint of respect in his eyes. I think they fought like that because they believed in each other. Because they knew that standing together, they could face anything, even the end. I'll never forget the sight of those humans, battered and bloodied, standing firm when no one else would. They changed that day's outcome. They changed my view of them forever. With that, Trexer fell silent, leaving the young recruits in a contemplative hush. They looked at one another, a mixture of awe and respect dawning in their expressions. Where before they'd seen humans as little more than oddities, they now glimpsed something far deeper, a strength they'd never considered. Trexer stood, casting one last look over the group, his eyes soft with memory. Now, perhaps, you'll think twice before mocking a human's bravery. It's a fire that burns hot enough to make even the strongest tremble. He turned to leave, his scarred figure fading into the shadows. The recruits sat quietly, minds reeling, wondering what other secrets the humans might hold. The alien recruits sat in thoughtful silence, still reeling from Commander Trexer's story of human bravery. Just when they thought they understood humanity's strange strength, the veteran surprised them again. Bravery is just one part of what makes humans remarkable, Trexer said, his voice softer now, though no less intense. But it's their kindness, their selflessness, that truly sets them apart. Jaren frowned, skeptical as ever. Commander, with respect, kindness doesn't win wars. Trexer looked at him, one scarred brow arching in quiet challenge. Doesn't it? Let me tell you about Folka 4. The young aliens leaned forward, captivated despite themselves. They'd heard only rumors of the war on Folka 4, a devastating conflict that had uprooted entire colonies and reduced cities to rubble. No one talked about that battle without a shadow crossing their face. Folka 4 was a bloodbath, Trexer began, his voice low and somber. An enemy fleet had descended upon the colonies, leveling everything in their path. Refugees flooded to the safe zones by the thousands, mothers, elders, children, civilians with no means to defend themselves. Our alliance forces were stretched thin, desperately trying to protect the few strongholds we had left. He paused, his gaze distant. I was stationed on Folka 4 at the time, tasked with leading an evacuation convoy to our last standing fortress. We had barely enough shuttles, barely enough time. The enemy was close, advancing too quickly for us to move everyone to safety. Trexer's expression darkened, haunted. We needed reinforcements, but the response was slow. And then, the humans arrived. Just a small fleet of medical ships and relief personnel, but they came straight into the danger zone without hesitation. I watched them land on the planet, risking everything to bring supplies and evacuate the injured. Grix's disbelief was clear in her voice. But they must have known the risk. Why would they? Because they couldn't stand by and watch. Trexer replied simply. I still remember the leader, Dr. Amelia Carter. She was a civilian, a healer, not a soldier. She'd brought a team of medics and volunteers, some with no combat training at all. She should have been terrified. But when I met her, she was focused, calm, and resolute. Trexer's face softened, his respect for this human clear. The humans set up triage zones, small safe areas where they treated the wounded, our people and their own, even the few injured from the enemy. They treated everyone. I'd never seen anything like it. Jaren shook his head, still struggling to grasp it. They treated their own enemies? Why? Because that's what humans do, Trexer replied. They put life above all else. Dr. Carter was clear with her team. Anyone who needed help got it. They shared supplies, medicines, even food, despite not knowing if they'd have enough for themselves. Trexer paused, letting his words sink in. The recruits shifted, uneasy, trying to comprehend this strange altruism. There was one moment, he continued, his voice lower now. We were deep in enemy territory, guiding a convoy of refugees towards safety. Out of nowhere, an enemy bombardment hit the valley ahead, collapsing the only bridge we could use. With no way forward, panic set in among the refugees. It was chaos. He took a deep breath, recalling the scene with painful clarity. And then, Dr. Carter stepped forward. She was just one woman, with no weapon, no armor. But she stood there, raising her voice over the crowd, calming them. I remember her saying, "We'll find a way, together." She kept saying it, even as enemy forces closed in. Mira's face softened, her eyes reflecting the weight of the story. What happened next? Trexer's gaze flicked to her, and a rare, gentle smile appeared on his face. She led her team to work quickly, using whatever they had, scraps of metal, lengths of cable, debris, to make a makeshift bridge. Her medics lifted the children and the elderly across, one by one. Some of our soldiers joined in, inspired by her example. By the time the enemy caught up, the last of the refugees were across. He shook his head slowly. But Dr. Carter didn't cross. She and two of her medics stayed behind, holding the line long enough for us to get the refugees to safety. She told her team to save others first, to do whatever it took. Grix's defiance was gone, replaced by a quiet reverence. Did she survive? Trexer nodded, but his eyes were distant. Just barely. They fought to hold back the enemy until the last refugees made it to safety. When the last child crossed that bridge, she finally allowed herself to fall back. We barely managed to pull her from the line in time. The young recruits sat in silence, struggling to process the depth of such selflessness. They had heard of sacrifice before, but rarely had they encountered such self-sacrifice for the sake of others, especially for strangers. Trexer's expression softened. Dr. Carter and her team saved hundreds that day. I saw our people, and even some of our enemy, survive because of her kindness, her absolute refusal to abandon anyone in need. It was a lesson none of us forgot. He looked over each recruit, his voice gentle but firm. You call them primitive because they lack our technology or strength. But they have something we often overlook, an unyielding compassion. They fight for each other, not just for survival, but for the very principle that no one should be left behind. As Trexler's words faded into silence, the recruits felt a deep stirring within them. They had never considered kindness as a form of strength, yet here was a story that painted it as vital, powerful, and undeniably heroic. Trexler rose, glancing back at the recruits, his final words resonating in the stillness. Remember this story, and remember that kindness is more than an action, it's a force. In the hands of humans, it becomes as powerful as any weapon. He left them in that silence, each recruit struggling to reconcile their former beliefs with the reality Trexler had revealed. The young recruits' initial skepticism had faded, replaced by a quiet reverence. They sat, engrossed in Commander Trexler's stories, their previous arrogance humbled by the tales of human bravery and kindness. But their curiosity about one final mystery still lingered: humans' peculiar technology and their approach to warfare. Trexler seemed to sense this and paused, as if savoring the change in their attitudes. "You think humans are primitive because their technology isn't like ours," he began. "But humans have a knack for invention that goes far beyond the designs of their ships or weapons. Let me tell you about the siege of Cortex 3. The recruits leaned forward, eager to hear more. They'd studied Cortex 3 in their history classes, an infamous battlefield where human forces had held off an enemy 10 times their size. No one fully understood how. It was an outpost, barely fortified, with a small garrison of humans who were there to monitor the planet's resources. Trexler explained, his voice steady, almost reverent. They hadn't come to fight, they were researchers, explorers. Yet, when the Ankathi raiders arrived, they found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. Grixa, who had been quiet since the last story, spoke up. "Why didn't they retreat?" Trexler gave a faint, grim smile. Retreat wasn't an option. Their ships were too slow, and the Ankathi ships had already blocked their escape routes. By the time the human command realized they were under siege, the Ankathi had surrounded them. It looked like a massacre in the making. He paused, letting the weight of the situation settle in. But instead of surrendering, they started preparing. They used everything they had, old machinery, research equipment, even scraps from their own buildings, to fortify their position. They didn't have plasma weapons like ours, so they created projectile-based traps and defensive systems from repurposed mining tools and explosives. I've never seen anything like it. The recruits exchanged stunned glances. Jaren's expression was one of awe. They turned mining equipment into weapons? Indeed. Their resourcefulness was astonishing. They fashioned defensive walls, concealed trenches, and makeshift turrets that launched projectiles with deadly accuracy, Trexler said. And they were precise, too. They knew that their only chance of survival lay in using every available advantage: terrain, timing, and sheer ingenuity. Mira's eyes sparkled with admiration. But how did they manage to hold off the Ankathi? Trexler chuckled. Because humans have a certain unpredictability that the Ankathi couldn't counter. The Ankathi, like most invaders, expected conventional warfare. But the humans' tactics were anything but conventional. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The humans split their forces into small teams, attacking from unexpected angles, then vanishing into tunnels they dug beneath the camp. They rigged the ground with traps that would go off if the Ankathi stepped in the wrong spot, catching them completely off guard. They even used sound to their advantage, creating sonic devices that disoriented the enemy soldiers. The recruits listened, captivated by this blend of cleverness and courage. Grixa shook her head in disbelief. So they fought a technologically superior enemy with nothing but improvised weapons and tricks? Trexler's expression softened. Tricks, yes. But also intelligence, planning, and relentless determination. The humans didn't simply fight, they adapted, using the enemy's expectations against them. The Ankathi grew paranoid, retreating from shadows and flinching at every sound. In a matter of days, the Ankathi went from being an overwhelming force to a scattered, desperate group, terrified of what might come next. Jaren's skepticism had been replaced by pure fascination. Did they win, Commander? Trexler nodded, his eyes alight with respect. After a week of unrelenting resistance, the Ankathi lost their nerve. Their commander ordered a full retreat, humiliated by the humans' tactics. The survivors described it as a nightmare, an enemy that knew no fear, that used every piece of scrap, every trick to hold the line. The humans had transformed their limitations into strengths, fighting with a cunning that was as deadly as any weapon. The recruits sat in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the primitive humans they'd mocked earlier with the tactical masterminds Trexer described. "Don't misunderstand me," Trexer said, his tone grave. "Human technology may appear crude compared to ours, but never mistake simplicity for weakness. Their technology is an extension of their resilience. Where we rely on advanced weaponry, they rely on adaptability and instinct, always finding a way forward, no matter the odds." Mira's face lit up with a newfound understanding. "So, they're not weak or foolish. They just think differently." Trexer nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Humans use technology as a means, not an end. They're willing to sacrifice the perfection of a weapon for its functionality. And when faced with challenges, they push those limits, creating solutions that none of us would ever consider." He looked over each recruit, seeing in their eyes a glimmer of the respect and admiration he felt for humanity. "You see, humans are fighters, not just because of their bravery, but because of their ability to make something out of nothing, to take the smallest chance and turn it into a victory. They understand the stakes, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect their own." Trexer's expression softened as he prepared to leave. "So next time you think of humans as weak or backward, remember Cortex 3. Remember that those so-called primitive beings held off a force that should have destroyed them. Their ingenuity, their relentless will to survive, that's what makes them powerful allies." With that, he turned and strode away, leaving the young recruits to reflect on everything they had learned. Where once they'd felt contempt for the humans, they now felt a profound respect, a sense of awe at the resilience of the species they had so lightly dismissed. And as they sat there in silence, the recruits understood, these humans were not to be underestimated. They were something far more, an enigma, an inspiration, and perhaps, in the end, the allies the young aliens would be grateful to have by their side.